Good day to you.
Good day to you.
It's really an honor for me to have you with us today.
Well, thank you.
Just right now, I would like to tell you that what you do, I find revolutionary in several ways. First of all, because it basically unites different religions
Right.
in the sense that no religion is better than the other one, which
Right.
is actually amazing. I think nobody else managed to do that. So I hope that if you keep on doing what you're doing, you will do that scientifically, and there will be more peace in the world.
I hope so.
And another thing, I'm not really sure whether you continue doing this work, but one of the things I've read in your book is that even some animals can actually have insights or maybe small enlightenments.
Right.
So I think that maybe it's something that vegans definitely would love to know. And actually, it makes this world even deeper because those
Right.
little beings that cannot talk to us, they actually have something happening in them. So thank you
That's
for
true.
that.
My pleasure.
I know that you're a doctor and a professor.
Right.
So you have these two titles. Can you please explain what you do as a doctor and what you do as a professor?
Well, thank you. Well, as a doctor, I guess the main thing that I do is research and also my work with patients. So, we'll have patients who come in who have various issues and problems, and I see them as a medical doctor. And then, of course, as a medical doctor, I also do a lot of research, which leads to the study of the various religious and spiritual practices and experiences that people have. We also do a variety of other studies as in my role here in integrative medicine. So we also focus on things like diet and nutrition. We look at how different supplements and antioxidants and anti-inflammatories help people with different disorders. So all of that kind of comes under the rubric of being an MD, a medical doctor. As far as being a professor goes, that usually deals a little bit more with teaching, I guess. And I do teach students in a variety of capacities, all the way from those who are in college and even high school, all the way up through medical school and medical residents, people who are already doctors, but they're still in training, and teaching them about the brain, about neuroimaging, and to a large extent about, things like spirituality and religion in the context of human health and well-being, and how that can be incorporated into a person's practice, and what kinds of questions should be asked, those kinds of things. But it's more teaching oriented, I guess, as a professor.
Thank you. Could you say that you're sort of a preacher of neurotheology?
uh, I don't know if I would use the word preacher, but yes, definitely, neurotheology is something I'm very passionate about. I love to talk about, I love to teach people about, and to that extent, yes, I'm always a huge advocate for it, and hope that it is something that, as you were saying in the introduction, is something that we can turn to as a way of helping us to understand religions in general, help people to perhaps be more understanding and more compassionate of those people who think differently than them, and also find ways of kind of linking what we can know scientifically with what we can know spiritually, in an endeavor to ultimately advance who we are as human beings and really help the human species, all of us, be a little bit better as individuals, and help to take care of each other, help to take care of ourselves, help to take care of the world.
Mm-hmm. That's true. I wanted to ask you, in your book and also on some interviews that I've listened of yours, you share about this great doubt that you experienced that actually made you look deeper into these aspects of what enlightenment is. What do you actually do these days? Maybe you have a certain practice of yours, like reflection, or maybe you decided to actually put other practices into your life as well. Can you please share what you do?
Sure. Well, I definitely, as you mentioned, a lot of this really derived from just my own searching for answers to questions. To me, the big questions about the nature of reality, and why people believe different things. And so, to me, even when I was a kid, I sort of felt like, well, if there's a reality, then why are we all coming to different conclusions? And so I set off trying to think about it, and in many ways, it was a self-reflection. I sometimes refer to it as kind of a philosophical meditation. It was a way of just kind of focusing on what we could know, focusing on different ideas, different perspectives, different beliefs, different traditions, and kind of sorting through them, sifting through them to try to understand which ones could really say something very definitive. You mentioned this whole process of doubt. The way I started to approach it was that if there was anything that I was just not completely certain of, it didn't mean it was wrong. It just meant I wasn't sure. And I kind of put it over into this realm of doubt, so to speak, that I would just kind of hold on to it and see, and keep going. As I went through this process, this is kind of now around when I was in college and starting into medical school and so forth. I began to really challenge myself in terms of where my thoughts come from, where do my ideas and beliefs come from. And as I kept kind of pursuing this, more and more went into this realm of doubt. It seemed like there was less and less I could be certain about. And eventually, it was actually around the time that I was getting ready to go to medical school. And I thought, well, before I go, I have to figure this all out. And so I spent a whole summer really just kind of in a lot of deep reflection and contemplation, a very meditative type of process. As you were kind of alluding to, it's not a formal practice. I wouldn't say that I follow Buddhist principles or Hindu or whatever, but it's just sort of my own thing. And as I really got into that process, I eventually had this experience that I only know to describe as sort of an infinite doubt, that it was just that everything was unknowable. And one of my colleagues said to me that, here I was trying to find answers and I hit this experience of infinite doubt. And he said, that must have been the worst experience you could ever have had. And I thought about that for a moment. And I said, well, no, actually, it was just the opposite. It was the most incredible experience that I really felt. It was very powerful. It felt very calming. And in many ways, everything became one. I mean, everything was just kind of thrust into this infinite doubt. And what I think it did for me on one level was give me a kind of experience that encouraged me to begin to look into mystical and spiritual experiences even more, having an experience that I couldn't quite understand or describe, and see where the similarities and the differences were. But it also took away a lot of that angst and a lot of that, allowed me to let go of that whole process, but continue to explore it at the same time. And so for me, the whole field of neurotheology kind of in many ways arose out of that, this idea of kind of, how do we look at things analytically and scientifically, but what do we do when we have these kinds of spiritual feelings, trying to figure out a way of bringing them together. And as I did that, then I became very fortunate that when I was in medical school, I could continue the work both in terms of what was going on in my own mind, but then beginning to use brain imaging and start to look at people doing these kinds of practices and having these kinds of experiences. And that from there developed a lot of hopefully where, neurotheology is at the moment. And hopefully there's a long way to go.
I really resonated with this part of your book where you described this infinite doubt. That's not something that I experienced in particular about the doubt thing, but I remember one weekend in my life when I really started questioning everything I had. And I felt that nothing made sense. Nothing I did actually brought any results. So I was so depressed that at a certain moment, I actually felt relieved. I don't know how to express this, but I went deeper in this weekend depression. And then at a certain moment, it felt that I could no longer go any deeper in that state. And there was actually no way but just to go somewhere upwards. And I thought, okay, so maybe it is as it is. And that's actually another way to put what you do, is that nobody actually has the right to say that this is the only truth. No religion has the right, the truth. And actually there are like infinite ways to get to this enlightenment, to this different space of consciousness.
Well, absolutely. And as you said, I mean, part of what's in, one of the more recent books that I wrote, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, the results of a survey that we ran where we got a couple thousand people describing their spiritual experiences. And as you mentioned, I mean, there were many that were somewhat similar to what you just talked about, the sort of the hitting rock bottom, so to speak, and whether that was out of hitting rock bottom because of health issues, because of addictions, just because of total confusion, depression, whatever it was. that once that bottom is hit, then there's the notion that now you're moving up, and there's kind of this reflexive response within the individual that becomes very, very positive, and sometimes even, kind of an ecstatic type of experience. And that is a pathway. And as you said, I mean, there is definitely no one pathway that seems to work. And for those individuals who have come from traditions that they feel very strongly about, Catholicism, Russian Orthodox, whatever, those can be profound pathways. And certainly those are pathways that people have gone down over the last hundreds, if not thousands of years. And they can be very powerful for people as well, and can connect them to their sense of spirituality, their sense of God, if that's, relevant to them. And even for people who aren't religious, they're, part of what we talk a lot about in the context of people who are agnostic or atheist is the notion that people are still striving for a feeling of connection, a feeling of wanting to belong, a feeling of being part of the universe, being part of some greater interconnected thing of the universe. Some people find spirituality through creativity, through music, through art, through exercise even, so there are a lot of different pathways that people can turn to that can help to kind of awaken them and enlighten them into a new way of thinking about themselves and a new way of thinking about the world around them and how they interact with that world.
You said that you also work with people that have different diseases. I wanted to ask you, maybe it's a weird question, but maybe it's not such a weird question. Are there any kinds of diseases that under certain circumstances, or when you scan the brains of those people, actually look similar to experience from what you saw with people that work with meditation? I mean, like maybe schizophrenia is not actually such a bad thing if you look at the brain and its activity.
It's a really good point, and a very important question. It's part of what we talk about in neurotheology, the idea that, how do we look at what happens when the brain is not functioning properly? There's some sort of disorder. And there are not a huge number of studies, but there are a growing number of studies that have looked at this in different kinds of ways. So, for example, there was a very interesting couple of studies that looked at people who had injury to their brain. And they found that when people had injuries to the parietal lobe, which is located in the back of the brain, those individuals were more likely to have feelings of self-transcendence and some type of sort of spiritual feeling. And that's interesting because in our brain scan studies, we found that when people are meditating or praying and have this deep spiritual experience where they kind of lose their sense of self, that they have decreases of activity in this parietal lobe. The parietal lobe normally helps us to create our sense of self and to establish where we are in the world. So we had always hypothesized that if that area starts to quiet down, that you begin to lose your sense of self, you begin to lose the boundaries between objects in the world, and you have that feeling of oneness or connectedness. So if you already have an injury in that area, which is what some of these studies have shown, that helps to facilitate that kind of an experience. And in and of itself, that to me is very interesting. Now, another study was looking at patients who have a neurodegenerative disease, Parkinson's disease. And they found something very interesting, that when Parkinson's disease is, it affects the dopamine system in the brain, and it can affect both sides, or sometimes it can affect one side more than the other. And what they found is that when it affected one side more than the other, that sometimes was associated with a loss of religious beliefs and experiences. And there's been some evidence to suggest that dopamine is part of the process that helps people to engage their religious and spiritual selves. So the fact that as dopamine is reduced, and particularly on one side or the other, that there could be changes in how a person looks at their religious and spiritual selves. So, there are some studies that are starting to look at this and starting to look at different disorders. And you mentioned schizophrenia. I mean, obviously there's the well-known cases that people always think about, the person who says they're Jesus Christ and truly believes that they're Jesus or the Messiah or something like that. What do we do with that? And we know that schizophrenia is associated with different changes in the brain, again, particularly the dopamine areas. And so all of that kind of helps us to understand what this relationship is between the brain and these different spiritual feelings. In terms of another part of that question, which you were kind of alluding to, is what's normal? What's okay to be. to some extent, it has less to do with what's going on in the brain and more to do with how the person just functions in the world. So if you have deep spiritual experiences and feelings, that can be wonderful. I mean, that can make people feel great. That can really help people. It can make people adapt better in society. On the other hand, if you have true schizophrenia and you're not able to hold a job and you're not able to have relationships and you have hallucinations that you can't control, then most likely that is maladaptive and doesn't, isn't helpful. But certainly, people have thought about the relationship between a variety of different disorders, particularly brain disorders, and how they are related to these spiritual experiences. And it's a piece of the puzzle. It's telling us something about what's going on in the brain and how whatever's going on in the brain is associated with these kinds of experiences.
There is such a phenomenon that there are some enlightened teachers that actually have something called a satsang when people get with them in the same room. I wanted to ask you also about this. Have you made any experiments in those kinds of situations? For example, like the person who is actually being scanned is not doing anything in particular, but there is someone who is actually called enlightenment, for example. As far as I understand, under such circumstances, this enlightened person sort of passes this kind of state to this person.
Mm.
I was wondering whether you have somehow researched this and how it is happening to the brain. Is it possible that two people start to resonate the same way, even one of them wasn't doing anything in particular?
Well, so we have done a little bit of research in that area, and we are certainly hoping to do more. I'm hoping that we'll be able to do a larger study to be able to explore that. At one point, we were given an opportunity to do something similar to what you're talking about, which is to study the effect of a particular practice that was called the oneness blessing, where people believed that they could kind of transmit this blessing to other individuals. And so we scanned the receiver who didn't know if the blessing was being given to them or not. Now, we never published this data because we just never got enough individuals through it. But what was interesting about it was that we actually only were able to get 4 individuals to do the study. There were 2 sessions, one where they were receiving the blessing, one where they were not. They got it half right. And so, which is basically a flip of a coin, because they either had one or the other, and they were at 50%. So 4 people does not really prove anything very definitively. So, but we didn't see any clear evidence that, all of them felt that difference. On the other hand, when we looked in the brain itself, there were a couple of small areas that were different in all 4 people when the blessing was being given versus when it was not. Whether that, when you talk about a couple of areas, it's hard to know whether or not that just happens to be kind of a random result, or was that something really there and some people felt it, some people didn't. That's why I think ultimately we need to do more studies to be able to look at that. From the perspective of neurotheology, one of the things that I've always argued is that we need to be open to a variety of different possibilities, and we need to work towards developing approaches to measuring phenomenon that are difficult to measure. And so, a brain scan may not be the best way to measure these kinds of things. Maybe there are other approaches. Maybe we need to be looking at electrical changes or magnetic fields or something different. And so, we want to always do good science, but science continues to advance, and we never knew about X-rays until we developed an X-ray detector, and now that we have that, we know what X-rays are. So is it possible that there are some other waveforms or other energy forms that we can't detect right now? Sure, that's a possibility, and we should be open to that. But on the other hand, we also want to make sure that we keep developing the science as the best way as possible, so that we're not going down paths that are not helpful. But on the other hand, we want to do our best to be open to all the different possibilities.
I wanted to share with you, I had a chance to meet some ex-KGB people who actually made a kind of a course dedicated. I'm sure you know something called distance viewing in
Yes.
USA. So it's similar, but it's different still. What those guys made in KGB, they experimented with making poems, like writing poems dedicated to someone.
Mm.
They put this person, this someone, in a different part of the city, And a group of 8 people, because it was actually 8 people, they were writing poems dedicated to this person.
Mhm.
And there was a doctor who was taking different parameters from blood pressure to, I mean, everything they could do in the 80s.
Right.
And they actually noticed that there were significant changes when those people made those poems and they were reading them aloud. So the thing is that what they discovered when they were reading them silently, it made not such difference when they read it aloud and all these other people were present and were listening to these wishes. So I don't know, maybe that would be of some interest here.
Well, yeah, a similar kind of thing. I mean, I think part of what we need to do is try to understand, one, whether such phenomena are real. And there, as you said, I mean, there are a lot of different studies that are out there. People have done a large number of studies trying to assess whether consciousness can affect random number generators and other objects at a distance in one way or another, and including human beings. The data seems to suggest that it can happen. The effects tend to be small. So, that's also part of the issue, which is that even if we can do this, the effects themselves may be very small and difficult to actually feel. On the other hand, even if they're very small effects, that's very paradigm shifting in terms of how we understand consciousness and what it can do, and whether or not our minds or our brains can somehow affect objects remotely. And so, yeah, I think we should continue to explore that and continue to evaluate it. One, to just understand whether or not it happens. And then two, if it does, is there some mechanism that we can look at? And we've done some studies looking at practices like mediumship, where people are presumably getting in touch with the spirits of the dead. And we find very distinct changes going on in the brain. One of the areas that seems to be particularly affected is the frontal lobe. This is an area that in these practices actually starts to quiet down. Now, our frontal lobe normally kind of helps us to pay attention to the world and to kind of keep all of the ways in which we think in order. And so maybe when that shuts down, it kind of opens us up to being able to perceive the world in different ways. Whether those ways are accurate or not, again, is still another question. But it is something that is theoretically testable. And I would certainly encourage people to explore that more and more, and see if we can find some definitive, more definitive evidence about what these practices are, and if they happen, what is their physiology, and how might they be useful in terms of understanding how we function as human beings.
I would like to ask you for some theoretical part of
Okay.
our, since I was reading the Russian version of your book,
Okay.
I may misname some of the things
Okay.
because I just translate them from Russian.
Sure.
Can you please explain how the spectre of consciousness works?
Mm.
How you see it from the scientific point, and what actually is happening at each of these levels in our brain?
Right. Well, so, in the How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain book, we did talk about different levels of consciousness, and how they might be related to different brain processes, going all the way from the very rudimentary aspect of how we interact with the world. And to some degree, as you mentioned earlier on in the introduction, how animals interact with the world. So we take in sensory information and we see what's going on and we react and we go towards things that are good, like food. We avoid things that are bad, like a predator or a cliff or something like that. And so we do have some very basic ways in which we respond to the world. We have instinctual ways in which we respond to the world. And then ultimately, as we kind of develop more and more complex brains, and as animals start to be able to think more and more about the world, we get to a level of kind of actual personal awareness, not just that, it's cold out, but I'm cold. And so I need to put something warm on or something like that. And so this ability to reflect on ourselves is a very fundamental part of human awareness. And in fact, we even went back and forth in our own way of looking at this, try to decide, should we call it consciousness? Should we call it awareness? On one hand, those terms are used often in an overlapping kind of way. I mean, awareness tends to be, again, awareness of the world around us. Consciousness usually a little bit more specifically refers to kind of self-awareness, the awareness of who we are as individuals. But certainly the notion of this consciousness or this awareness might be, even far greater than what we the way to look at it in the kind of current cognitive neuroscience perspective, is that our brain creates consciousness. But if you do look at this from other perspectives, like a Buddhist or a Hindu perspective, consciousness creates our brain. And so it kind of flips things around completely. Now, which way is correct and which idea is incorrect? Difficult to really know for sure. It's difficult to know if our brain is creating the consciousness or receiving the consciousness or processing the consciousness. And again, this is part of where I think the study of neurotheology may help us out, because we can look at individuals. You were talking about certain enlightened masters who are able to control their consciousness in ways that most people are not. And if we can study that, we might be able to say, oh, okay, well, they have a different frontal lobe, or they have a different, some other structure in their brain that allows them to do that in different kinds of ways. But that's, and then ultimately we get up to these kind of, more spiritual or even mystical states of consciousness, where we look at the world in a way and experience the world in a way that most people don't. Those individuals, they often, that's where they start to become that kind of enlightened individual, and to look at the world in fundamentally new ways that really even go beyond what science can arguably say about the world, because science is looking at the physical world, and these mystical perspectives seem to look at the world not only scientifically, but kind of what's behind all of that. And again, to me, that's part of where neurotheology comes in, to help us understand all of the different ways in which we experience the world, help us to understand how they're related to each other, so that we can try to answer that ultimate question about what is the nature of reality.
Do you think that people in different areas of the world have or can be on different levels of this consciousness? For instance, people in the West have more time, more spare time, and actually more resources to reflect on what is happening with them, because they don't really fight for the food or for the worms, for survival, basically, than people other underdeveloped areas inflicted by war and, I mean, other circumstances. Do you feel that it's also influenced by the environment?
Well, I think there's certainly an environmental influence in terms of what is a person's mind kind of free enough to be able to explore certain things. I think that that can be helpful. But certainly one goes back historically, even. I mean, it is often some of the true spiritual leaders of the world who have emerged out of areas that have a great deal of chaos and conflict and so forth. So sometimes that's part of what helps people get there. Other times, the more you have the freedom that you don't have to worry about where you're going to get your next meal, you don't have to worry about walking down the street and getting killed, then, those individuals can start to reflect more and more on creative processes, on spiritual processes. It really can go both ways. And in fact, again, that's kind of an interesting neurotheological question, which is what takes people, in these different directions. Why is it that you could go to some slum in India, and where people are starving and it's horrible conditions, and there's one of them that becomes, an enlightened master? Well, why that one? Why that individual? What was going on that allowed that person to rise up out of that horrific period, and that time and place, and do something different than everybody else who was there? So, and again, I mean, sometimes it is the difficulty and the challenges and the strife that we suffer that ultimately allows that person and their brain to kind of bring them into that new way of thinking about things. They look at what suffering is, like with Buddha, or they look, you think about like a Mother Teresa or something like that, that kind of says, no, I got to be immersed in that suffering in order to achieve my true kind of spiritual understanding. So it can kind of go both ways. There is no one way to do it, but certainly it can be a great hindrance to certain people. I mean, I feel very fortunate. I've grown up in an environment that allowed me a lot of freedom. And I think that's what allowed me to kind of question things and work towards this infinite doubt. I was okay with that experience. Whereas other people, if there's a great deal of uncertainty just in living, they may not feel comfortable even going down that kind of a path.
That's true. In every area, there is possibility to get enlightened.
Right. To me, one of the really exciting things that came out of the survey that we did of people's spiritual experiences is that, one, there doesn't seem to be one path, that there could be many different ways in which people can go. And two, it's something that can happen to anyone. You don't have to be a monk that's sitting off on a mountain somewhere. You don't have to be a deeply religious individual. It can happen to those individuals, but it can happen to, I mean, everyone has the opportunity to get to this experience. And that to me was very exciting. I mean, one of my favorite examples, which is in the book, is the guy who's just driving down the street, driving his truck down the street and suddenly like sees everything completely differently. So there isn't just a one way to do it. And it is seems to be something that irrespective of where you are, who you are, your age, gender, socioeconomic status, it's a matter of finding that perspective. And in fact, my old Hindu professor in college, one of the things that always struck me a lot that he talked about is that you can be enlightened, be a garbage man, or you don't have to be this great spiritual person. It's a matter of how you embrace and engage life, and it doesn't matter what you do as long as you're doing it to the fullest experience that you can, and that you understand who you are, and you have that comfort in knowing how the world works and how you engage it. It doesn't matter what you do, so matter as how you do it.
Beautifully said. One question I had in mind is that what was the youngest age of the person who reported about those little or big enlightenments?
Yeah. In our survey, I think the youngest age was around, the youngest age that somebody was in was probably in their kind of middle teenage years, like around 14, 15. But interestingly, there are experiences that children have, even when they're 3, 4, 5 years old. There's some fascinating examples of people who have had near-death experiences at those early ages, and, really transforms who they are and in terms of how they think about the world. It does seem to be able to occur in every age and in people who are younger, older. Probably it's a little bit more likely in that kind of teenage to early adult age, because that's when your brain is, everything's still changing and things are coming online. I mean, as opposed to once you're about 35, 40 years old, where your brain itself doesn't change all that much on a day-to-day basis. But again, it can happen to anyone. It can happen when you're 80 years old. It can happen when you're 8 years old. And again, that to me is a very exciting piece of what neurotheology would look at. In fact, my wife and I wrote several articles on spiritual development, going from essentially birth through death, and looked at how our brain develops and how that's related to different spiritual experiences and beliefs, and matches up very well. When you're in your childhood years, between about 4 and 10, your brain has the highest activity levels that you have throughout your entire life. And it also has the sort of the greatest connectivity between different nerve cells and so forth. And part of what that means is that we can kind of think about the world in some very interesting and strange ways, which is part of what children often do. They think about God in very weird ways, and to us seems weird, but to them it makes perfect sense. So there's this whole sort of developmental process. Then as you get into your early adulthood, those connections have been cut back, but you're still developing some of the areas of your brain. And that's when a lot of your sort of formal ideas that you're now going to take with you through the rest of your life become a part of who you are. And that is when a lot of these experiences start to occur. But then as people get older, as we talked about earlier, sometimes as different brain areas start to shut down, or there's injuries or whatever, that can also predispose people to have very profound experiences as well. So there's many different ways in which these experiences can happen throughout a person's lifetime.
When you talk about these neuroconnections that happen in the mind, is it something that can be tracked scientifically? I mean, is it something that you basically can see when you scan?
Well, we see certain changes in the brain, that are associated with practices like meditation. We've done some studies looking at different belief processes, how people process different. We did a study looking at religious symbols and how different visual symbols affect the brain. So, on one hand, yes, you can see different areas of the brain. We know that, for example, that if the parietal lobe starts to shut down, that tends to be associated with people losing that sense of self, for example. Not as good at looking at specific beliefs. Like if somebody says, think about God, we can't find the neuron that lights up that's the God neuron per se, although again, maybe there often isn't. It's sort of a network of structures and neurons that are going on. But part of what also I think is kind of an interesting part of this, and I always kind of challenge my students when I teach them about brain function and brain imaging, is that when you think about the brain itself, You've got the neurons. When they fire, so to speak, they depolarize, and so sodium and potassium go rushing in and out of the cell. Different ions that are moving. You have electrical signals that are transmitting back and forth. You have the release of different neurotransmitters, serotonin and dopamine. You have blood flow that comes in. You have metabolic activity that comes in. So, where in all of that is the actual thought that you have? Where in all of that is consciousness? And we don't have an answer to that. We don't know, is it every neuron have consciousness and then you put them all together and we have kind of a larger consciousness? Is it possible that individual neurons don't have consciousness, but if you bring together thousands of them, they do? And if so, is it all of the connections themselves that lead to that consciousness? Is it the electrical activity, the serotonin and dopamine chemicals in the brain? We really don't have an answer to your question about how and where do thoughts actually arise. And that's also part of what leads down the path of saying, well, then is the brain really creating these thoughts, or is it merely, a receptacle for them, receiving them in some way, and that the thoughts are, out there in the world, and that we're just interpreting those different signals in a way that makes some kind of sense to us and gives us some kind of coherent picture of the world around us.
So maybe we're kind of robots and all this happens somewhere else where brain is like a display, like a processor.
Very possible. Right. Now, again, I mean, the one thing that is somewhat unique is this awareness piece. That a computer just does its processing. It doesn't know that it's doing mathematics. When we're doing mathematics, we know we're doing mathematics. And so what's the difference? But then again, I mean, there's people who are in the field of artificial intelligence, another tangentially related field, but may have some relevance in all of these discussions about, can we ultimately create a computer that has consciousness? And how would we know? I mean, how do I know you have consciousness? I only know that because you tell me you have it. And similarly, I don't know how, even if I ask a computer, are you conscious? And it says yes, how do I know that it's really conscious or it's just been programmed to say yes? But then if I ask you if you're conscious, how do I know that you're really conscious when you say yes, or somehow you've been programmed to say yes when you ask that question?
Maybe it's not really related to what you wrote about, but I want to ask you as a doctor and as someone who is learning the brain, is it a myth that when the neurons die, they cannot be sort of born or created or made again by the brain? For example, we have this myth in Russia, maybe it's everywhere, that when people are too nervous all the time, the neurons or something is definitely dying in the brain. And then the question is, can it be changed? Can it change in the future?
Right. At the moment, once something has died, we don't have a way of bringing that back. On the other hand, when the brain is injured, there are neurons that are kind of affected by that injury, but they can recover their function. And of course, sometimes you can grow and develop new neurons or new neural connections that allow a brain to respond to an injury like a stroke. So when somebody has an initial stroke, they may not be able to talk, but if you train them enough, then they can recover the ability to speak. Now, so what's going on? Are they recovering their ability to speak because a lot of the neurons didn't actually die? They just weren't functioning in that particular moment. And then as time has gone on, they recover their blood flow and then they ultimately recover their ability to function. Sure, that's part of it. But also we know that certain parts of the brain can take over for areas that are injured. And so people can develop and learn and grow, new ways of processing that information, bypassing the areas that have been destroyed by whatever the process is, like a stroke. It's a little bit of both. I mean, but my understanding generally is that if a neuron dies, then that neuron cannot be brought back. But whether or not other neurons can take over for it, and again, that implies that it has fully, completely died, as opposed to a neuron that's just been kind of stunned or isn't working properly right now, but can recover its function ultimately. A little bit like a muscle. I mean, if you pull your muscle and you rest it a little bit, then in a week or two you can use it again completely normally. If I take a knife and I completely cut the muscle, it's probably never going to be able to be used again. But on the other hand, maybe you can use other muscles that are around it that can help support it and allow you to use that particular area, that limb or that leg or whatever, in a relatively normal way, even though you're not using the same muscle that you have truly completely destroyed.
Mm-hmm. So when you say that the new neuroconnection gets made, is it something that you can actually see under the microscope, or is it a matter of saying this, that there is a neuroconnection?
It's both. So we know that when people have a stroke, for example, and they start to recover function, that we can see, more blood flow, more activity, more neurotransmitters going on in areas that were initially not functioning or not functioning very well. And I mean, they haven't done this so much with human studies because to look under the microscope, you need the actual tissue, but they've certainly done a lot of animal studies that do show that neurons can grow and develop new connections and can create many new connections. In fact, I mean, interestingly, and this goes back a little bit to one of your earlier questions about environment, animal studies have shown that animals that are raised in very enriching environments, very comforting, very, with a lot of stimuli, will have lots of neural connections, whereas those animals that are raised in, a very solitary kind of environment with very few stimuli will have many fewer connections. They'll have very few connections compared to an animal that's brought up in a very enriched environment. And human beings are somewhat similar too. I mean, obviously, if you go to school and you have great teachers and they teach you all about lots of different things, then your brain develops a lot of different neural connections and you kind of optimize your intelligence. And if you are not taught well and you're ridiculed and you're given a lot of very, you're raised by very bad parents and basically locked in your room, then you're not going to be able to use your brain very well, and your brain isn't going to have those neural connections.
Thank you. I have about three more questions.
Okay.
One of them is about animals. Since the book was written about the Enlightenment, have there been any other experiments or surveys made with animals to discover how conscious they can be?
I don't know if I would say that there are, completely new studies, but certainly there have been some fascinating studies that have looked at animals and tried to explore the nature of consciousness in animals and what they're aware of. We know, for example, that certain higher primates, like monkeys and so forth, and orangutans, when you put them in front of a mirror, they recognize themselves in the mirror. If you put like a mark on their head, they reach back to themselves to see that there's something, going on there. Dolphins also will spend more time looking at a mirror if you put marks on them. And so, there is some sense that animals certainly have emotions, that they have a variety of behaviors that are similar to human beings, especially in terms of reconciling differences when there's a fight and so forth. They can kind of make up, so to speak, and they can forgive and they can love and they can feel different emotions. To the extent that they have awareness, obviously the main problem is that there's a language barrier, so we have no way of asking them what they're really thinking. We can only look at what their behaviors are and what they seem to be doing and try to decide whether or not that's similar or dissimilar to what we do as human beings. I mean, a lot of animals, especially primates and dolphins, have brains that are very similar to human beings. They have frontal lobes, temporal lobes, parietal lobes. They do very similar kinds of things. And so, it seems like it would not be a huge stretch to say that they have at least some rudimentary levels of the kinds of awareness and consciousness that human beings have. But to what extent, and do they have something, do they believe things spiritually or not? Hard to know for sure, but something that's certainly worthy of exploration.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you about the weight, like kgs and grams. When people meditate or when enlightenment is happening, can you physically measure the difference between the two brains, like the brain that hasn't experienced that or the brain that does experience that?
Well, we're getting there. People have certainly done studies that have looked at individuals who have done meditation-based practices for many, many years versus those who have not. And there are differences in their brain. People who meditate for long periods of time have larger frontal lobes. We found changes in a structure called the thalamus, which is a very central structure that regulates our sensory information and helps different parts of our brain to connect with each other. Again, those people who've been doing these practices for long periods of time will have alterations in the activity levels in the thalamus, which are distinguished from those people who have not. Now, the problem with the actual study of enlightenment is that we never really know when it's going to happen. And so no one's done that definitive study where we've, scanned 1,000 people and then waited 20 years to see who got enlightened and who didn't. and then rescan them and see where the differences are. So, because part of the problem is that we don't know who's going to be enlightened and we don't know when they might be enlightened. And so we did a study of people going through a spiritual retreat program with the hope that we would capture some very intense experiences. And I think we did. And it showed changes not only in brain activity patterns, but also in terms of the dopamine levels in their brain and the sensitivity to dopamine. There are differences, but we're still trying to iron out exactly what they are and what they mean, and how well we can use that information to truly differentiate who is and who isn't, who has not had that kind of an experience. Of course, you also have kind of the larger picture problem of who determines who is enlightened versus, do we rely on the individual to say that they are? Do we need masters who can evaluate them and say, yes, that person is, that person isn't? There's some really fascinating questions that come up about how do we even know who is enlightened in the first place? And then how do we use that information to inform us about what we're seeing on the brain scans?
In your book, you share that you actually scanned yourself when you had certain experiences.
Mm.
I wanted to ask you, do you scan yourself regularly to notice the differences in your brain activity, what is happening? How do you research yourself? How do you survey yourself?
A lot of times I am a subject in my own studies. I always find that that's helpful to sort of see what's going on and what people are feeling. The scan that you mentioned, I went into the scanner, we were developing some stuff, and I said, well, let me try my contemplation. Let me try the contemplative process of kind of resting within that infinite doubt, so to speak, and see, what happens in my brain relative to when my brain is just sitting there doing nothing. And similar to other types of practices, I think that there was a decrease of activity in that parietal lobe. So, yes, there's, in my brain at least, there were certain things that seem similar. But as we have also learned, there's so many unique patterns that we've studied people in Christian prayer and Islamic prayer and Jewish prayer and Buddhist and Hindu and so forth. They are all unique in the sense that they all have certain unique patterns to them. By the same token, that doesn't make them better or worse. It just tells you what's going on in that person when they engage the experience in a certain kind of way. And so for me personally, it was interesting to see that there was something going on in my brain. Even for me, I think it would be helpful to continue to come back and keep looking at it, or to look at other aspects of my thought processes that I engage in, and to see what areas of my brain are being used when I get those feelings and have those different kinds of experiences, and where the similarities and the dissimilarities are. I hope that, part of, I feel like neurotheology has taught me, is a great sense of compassion and understanding for everyone's belief system, because all of us have a brain that's kind of looking out at the universe and trying to make some sense out of what is essentially an infinite universe with a very finite brain. And so it should not be a surprise to anyone that we come up with different conclusions and different ideas and different religious traditions, and that even within a tradition, that everybody feels things a little bit differently. So I think part of what it hopefully provides is this notion of a greater sense of understanding and compassion towards other people, and hopefully a way of looking at these different perspectives as a way of helping all of us try to put together what the nature of reality ultimately is. I think somehow it has to help us understand what each of these perspectives ultimately are and what they bring. In the world today with so much divisiveness, I think being able to say something where we can help people to see that other side, and help people see the different ideas and the different beliefs, and help them to be open to that, could hopefully be helpful. I'm a very idealistic guy, so I hope that this will help move humanity itself as a whole towards a new enlightenment. But whether we get there or not, time will tell.
Thank you, Dr. Newberg. It was great to have you on the show.
Well, thank you. It was a lot of fun. Great questions, and there's millions more. There's millions more questions. So we just got to all keep going. Well, probably the best thing to tell people is just that, if they have an interest, to go to my website. It's Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com. And on there are all the books that I have. And, some are more specifically targeting neurotheology. Some are a little bit more academic. Some are a little bit more popular, for just the popular readership. We have different research articles on there if people want to dive into the studies a little bit more. And as new articles, books, videos come out, certainly be posting all of that there. So that's probably the best way people can try to access what we're doing. And hopefully people just keep asking questions and keep exploring and working through their own doubt and hopefully finding enlightenment somewhere.
Thank you. All the links will be in description.
Thank you very much. We'll stay in touch. I'll let you know. We do have some new books coming out in a little while, so not sure, maybe in about a year or so. I don't know if you're familiar with William James. William James was a psychiatrist back in 1900, the early 1900s, and published a book called Varieties of Religious Experience, and we are doing kind of an updated version of that. So we're going to be looking at all the different varieties of people's experiences and talking about all this in more details. The next one on the road to trying to figure all this stuff out, but there's a lot more to come, I'm sure.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to that. Please keep me updated. Put me
Absolutely.
on your.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great day, and we'll stay in touch. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you. Take care.